The story before our story today involves an impromptu fish fry. They were around the lake. Jesus had been teaching. The crowd gathers. Jesus would move on a little. The crowd would follow. The crowd got bigger and bigger. Finally, big crowd. Everybody's hungry. Nobody brought lunch. One boy brought lunch. He had a couple of fish and some bread. And in the hands of Jesus, it feeds a multitude. But the popular teacher had gotten really popular. Perhaps that's why he thought it was time to scatter the party, and folks needed to get back to their homes because his popularity was growing, which meant the threat to him and to those around him was growing too. The power systems get pretty riled up when a man gets popular and he talks about peace. So he tells them to head on back, like the late night hotel crooner saying, "You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. It's time for you to take off, shoo, scat. Lakeside gathering is over." And so while he's getting them to head back home, he instructs the disciples to get in a boat and go to the other side while he rustles away the crowd. Finally, he's got some quiet. After the multitude has scurried along, Jesus takes to the mountain by himself to pray. Night falls, and he's in the alone and quiet of his devotion. Well, the story that happens in that night is told by three of our gospel writers. Mark includes a short version of this. John has an even shorter version. Luke leaves it out altogether. But Matthew, our version for today, is the fullest account. This is the only one to include the exchange with Peter. But Matthew is not just a historian. He's a preacher. Matthew has retold this story with layers of detail just so we might pick it up, all the different layers behind this story. But remember, Matthew had no idea we would be telling this story. He was a Jewish author writing to a Jewish audience in that day. And he has one purpose for his writing. He is trying to convince the Jews of his day that this one from Nazareth is the long-awaited Messiah. And they would have heard things, they would have picked up on things that we're certainly going to miss. This week, while I was preparing the sermon, I kept thinking about what if we had an old first-century Jewish man sitting in this sanctuary listening to this sermon while we're trying to make sense of this story. He would be going out of his mind. Because there's so many things in the story he would know, he would pick up on immediately because he's been instructed in the Hebrew Scriptures. We're not nearly as acquainted with the imagery and all the little nuances that he would pick up. So a dozen times through the sermon, he'd be over there trying to get my attention, raising his hand, interrupting, because he wants us to see that this is not a circus trick. This isn't about a guy walking on the water. If you listen to what's underneath it, it's a story of the nature and the function of the Christ. So, back to our story. Jesus has settled in for a time of prayer. But a time of quiet prayer is not the experience of the disciples. They're out on the Sea of Galilee, and the wind picks up, and the sea begins to roar. The weather started getting rough. The tiny ship was tossed. And after setting sail, the skies change, the winds gust, the waves begin to swell. Soon they are in an absolute panic because they are sure they're going to die at sea. They're fighting for their lives. Wind blowing in one direction, waves crashing overboard from the other direction. It's dark as midnight. They are certain this is it. They are going to die. And this isn't hyperbole. They've seen this happen over and over. They're out there on homemade boats. There's no advanced meteorology. Many of their fellow fishermen have gone under on nights like this one. This is just the kind of storm and just the kind of night that's meant the end for a lot of folks. By the way, if our Jewish listener were in the sermon, in the sanctuary, this is one of the places his hand would go up. He would not want us to miss the important symbol that water is for the Hebrew community. Because not only could somebody go overboard and drown, he would drown in the demonic deep. The sea is a symbol for evil and turmoil. Ever since God separated land from sea, we read that in Genesis just a little while ago. The scary deep has been the place where the demon forces abide, where Leviathan lives. They're not just afraid of the sea like we might be afraid if we fell over in a storm. For them, to fall over into the water is to enter the evil place where the sea monster takes you under for good. So these boaters are not just afraid they're going to fall into treacherous waters. They're afraid they're going to fall into the sea monster's lair. Wind and rain and waves and boat on the verge of capsizing to death. And some of them are bailing water and others of them are rowing. And then their muscles get tired and they switch places. The bailers start rowing, the rowers start bailing. They're yelling and spitting rain and they're fighting for their lives. And about 3 o'clock in the morning, having been up all night, no rest, blurry, bleary, fatigued, they see a figure come walking on the storm-raged sea. And Matthew says, but when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. Well, duh. Now, not only are they battling a storm, but a ghost has just emerged out of the demonic deep. And Jesus spoke to them and said, take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. And now our Jewish friend's hand is going crazy. You read it wrong, he says. You and your English translations. Jesus said to them, ego eimi. Jesus identified himself here the same way God spoke to Moses in the burning bush. Ego eimi. I am that I am, it is I. He's identifying with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's not just saying, hey guys, it's me. Besides, those of us who are steeped in the Hebrew Scriptures know it's only God who tames the waters. It's in Habakkuk. It's in the psalm you read just a little while ago. Only God can walk across the waters of chaos. He's announcing from the waves, ego eimi. He's announcing he's God. Take heart. Ego eimi. It is I am. Do not be afraid. And Peter, the impetuous Peter, speaks up. And of course, we would expect Peter to speak up. He seems to be always the first one to speak up or draw a sword or bow up or spout off. The ultimate extrovert. Peter was the kid in your class who would raise his hand before he had an answer. Just call on me, I'll figure something out to say before. It's not surprising that Peter would be the one to call out. What's surprising is what he says. I would have said, Jesus, come here and help me. Come stabilize this boat. But Peter says, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you. And Jesus says, come. Okay, you can pick on Peter all you want for losing faith, for sinking. Preachers have been picking on him for years and years and years, telling the same old tale on Peter. He was doing fine till he took his eyes off of Jesus. Don't take your eyes off of Jesus. Well, I'm freaked out that he stepped out in the first place. Storm and rain and darkness and sea monster, and he moves confidently into the teeth of the storm. Makes steps in an outrageous faith until he notices the wind, becomes frightened, and begins to sink. But when he does start under, Peter cries out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus reaches out his hand, catches Peter, and says, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" Even when we falter, Jesus saves. He pulls Peter into the boat, the wind stops, and those in the boat say, "Truly, you are the Son of God." And the Jewish listener's hand goes up again. He says, "That's what I've been trying to show you. Water is evil and chaos, Genesis and all beyond. Only God can walk on the water, Habakkuk and Psalms, remember. This is not a Houdini trick. This is a sermon, truly you are the Son of God. That's the point of the sermon. This is a story that tells us about the function and the nature of Jesus. Matthew wants those of us in the Hebrew tradition to hear this as a clear indication that the Messiah has come and that there is no wind, no storm, no evil, no chaos, no force in the world that Jesus cannot conquer. Think for a minute about the implications of that. Think about that if it's true. There is no wind, no storm, no evil, no chaos Jesus can't step on and conquer. Hopelessness, sinking job, eroding savings, a sea so vast and you are so small, bad investments, loneliness that envelops like the midnight of the storm, relationships tossed and dangerous. I have no idea what your storm looks like and how your boat is taking on water. But think about the implications of this story if you believe it. There is no wind, no storm, no evil, no chaos Jesus can't conquer. Well, there are skeptics, of course. There's some who don't believe the story. Some have studied the tides and the sea bottom terrain and declared times of the year and certain tide schedules when it might have been shallow enough, or the old joke about Jesus knowing where the rocks were, whatever. They're skeptics. But 3 of our gospel writers declare that this miracle happened on the Sea of Galilee. It's a sermon in motion declaring the Messiah. If you don't believe it, you don't believe it. But if you do believe it, if you do believe we worship the one who commands the storm to stop, who steps across the top of the waves, how can you both declare his power to stop a thunderstorm and not believe he's able enough to carry you through whatever choppy waters you're going through right now? There's plenty of fear to go around. Our culture's awash in terror that the storm's too big for them to survive and there are 100 different statistics that tell that story. In the United States right now, there are an average of 21 suicides every day and 25 attempts for every one that succeeds, and the number's on the rise. In the last 17 years, there's been a 200% increase in opioid and heroin deaths in the U.S., and Georgia ranks number 11 in the country in opioid deaths. We could go on and on and on. The realities that underscore that there are so many people afraid they're going under. There's so many people who feel like there is just no escaping the storm I'm in. So many people frightened by the waves and the wind. And I hear bits of these stories all over. About 10 years ago, I sat at lunch with a friend of mine. At the time, he was about 35 years old, and he told me he was $4 million in debt at 35. Life is scary. In the middle of one of my storms, an older friend told me, I was actually looking for a comforting word. He said, "No, I understand why you're terrified. You're not going crazy. You're just paying attention. You ought to be scared to death." Well, thanks. But nearly everybody in this room is being rocked by the storm in one way or the other. But I also have friends, and some in this congregation, who have come close, who have come dangerously close to going under. And they cried out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus reached out a hand and caught them before they went under. And they will tell you their story of rescue if you're close to going under too. They will tell you their story if it'll help you. As I said, the most common sermon from this passage is Peter took his eyes off Jesus, started to sink. That's the lesson here. Don't ever take your eyes off Jesus. But the story is about the nature and function of the Messiah. He commands the storm. He walks all over the chaos, and when we falter, he saves us. So in what part of your life do you need to believe that story? What's got you so afraid you wonder if you might go under? Into that fear, Jesus says, "Take heart. It is I. Do not be afraid." There is no wind, no storm, no evil, no chaos Jesus cannot conquer. And when you falter, he will save you. Thanks be to God. Go now in the confidence that you are in the care of the one who makes the storm obey. Go in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.